Hello everybody, my name is Krishna.Kishore and welcome back to my channel. So far in the playlist of Docker, what we have learned is we have learned about Docker introduction, the architecture of Docker, the drawbacks of virtual machine, and we have also seen the basic and the advanced commands we want to run while working with the Docker on a daily basis. We have also seen how to do the data management while working with Docker through volumes and bind mount. We choose either of them based on our requirement. We have also seen about networking in the Docker, why we want to create the customized network to ease the communication between the containers of same application or the containers which communicate each other to fulfill one particular request. And we have also seen how to create the Docker files. Why do we create the Docker files from simple to complex examples? And we have also launched each example in practice. If you haven't seen all this session before, I highly recommend to go through them and then come back to the current session because they are in CDs. And today when we will be talking about the Docker Compose, we will be dealing with network, volumes, some commands, so on and so forth. So it will be easy for you if you go through the previous discussions or the sessions. So today in this session, we will be discussing about Docker Compose. So the way how we do with the Docker Compose is very similar how we set up an application in the Kubernetes. So it is highly recommended to watch this video until end. In a very simple words, it's a combination of commands and configuration files. So what does it mean is, so in the previous discussion, when we set up some applications through Docker files, we had run some commands like Docker run, we have created some volumes, we have created a network, etc. Right? So in the previous session or until now, we had set up the single container or the single application, let's say just the front end, just the back end or the database. But in the enterprise application, we may end up creating the three-tier architecture application, right, which will have front end, back end, database, so on and so forth, right? So with Docker Compose, we will be creating all these three containers and the related resource like volume, network, environment variables, configurations, so on and so forth, and the relation between the front end and the back end to the database, etc. So all of these would be created in a one single file. All of these would be mentioned in the one single file, which would be Docker Compose YAML. So it becomes very easy to understand what we are doing in the current three-tier application, what are the various resources we are creating, and so on and so forth. We'll talk about the advantages of Docker Compose in a while. So why Docker Compose? Docker Compose, yeah. So one of the reasons is to configure the relationship between the containers. What does that mean is, so now when we're gonna set up the three-tier architecture application, so we will end up creating the front end, back end, database, so on and so forth. So we knew that the front end would be discussing with the back end and the back end would be talking to the database, etc. Right? So this Docker Compose will create the relationship between these relevant containers. Okay, and then it if we are not dealing with the Docker Compose, so how can we set up this application? We'll have to run the several commands creating the volumes, creating the network, front end, creating the front end container, back end container, database, the relation between the front end and the back end to the database, right? So we'll have to run various commands to set up this one just application, right? So to eradicate all these difficulties, we have Docker Compose, right? So I'll just repeat it for you for ease. One is to have the relationship between the containers of one single application, and here the containers can be the front end, back end, the database, and it would also create the relation between the other resources like volume, network, configurations, etc. Okay, and will if we are not going with the Docker Compose, we will end up running several commands to create volume, network, configuration, to create front end container, back end container, database. So it becomes quite tedious to maintain, to manage, to remember the history, so on and so forth. But what if we have all of this only in a one single file, and that file is a Docker Compose? We'll see in an example in a while, right? So we'll talk with an example. Okay, so what is the example we are doing over here, right? So what we'll do is that we'll create the front end application, we'll create the back end application, and we'll create the database. Okay, so the motto would be, when we launch this front end application on the browser, we'll supply some message, we'll enter some message, and this message would be processed by the backend, yeah, and the backend will store that message in the database. Okay, so this front end would be talking to the backend, to this backend, and this backend will store the message to the database, and the front end will also make a call to the backend to fetch all the messages what we have in the database, and it will show up on the UI. So this is an example. So we'll see this in practice. So what happens with that, right? So while setting up, so what are we doing is that this will prove that this particular application ends up creating the front end container, back end container, database, will be creating volumes, networks. Okay, and it will show us the Docker file, what are all the resources we have, and how to write the Docker Compose file. Sorry, not the Docker file, but the Docker Compose file. So we'll switch to an example. So I have pushed the example and all the relevant commands in our Docker repository. Okay, so if you see, if we switch to the Docker Compose, so I have explained everything over here, whatever we are discussing, right? So all of these are the essential Docker Compose commands which we end up running on the daily basis while working on it. Okay, and this is an example. I've pushed the working 3-tier architecture example over here, wherein we have front end, back end, and our Docker Compose file as well. Okay, so I would suggest you to clone this repo in your local machine and test it. So let's switch to our terminal. So I've already cloned that repo in my local machine, and so we have front end, back end, and we have a Docker Compose file as well. So we'll quickly walk through the Docker Compose file and we'll see what are we doing over here, right? So we just saw in a layman terms what is this example gonna do, but this is the Docker file, right? So we have a version, it defines the services. So how many services are we gonna create now? 3 services: the front end, the back end, and the database. Similarly, in other examples, we can end up creating the few or the more services based on an application's requirement, right? So we define the image like this. So this would be the image. So when we execute this Docker Compose, it will check for this image in the local machine, and if it doesn't exist, it pulls from the Docker Hub. And these are the environment variables, the DB password, username, etc. And we are also creating the volume. So we are creating the volume of name DB data, and this is the path of the container. That means whatever the data would be lying at this path would be written to the volume, namely DB data, and the network is AppNet. Okay, the database, the backend, and the front end are created in a one network, namely AppNet. Why? The reason is that these containers, the DB, backend, and the front end, would be talking to each other while executing this application. So we discussed the advantages of creating an application or several containers of an application in one network already. So I would suggest you to go to that video if you have, or if you wanted to learn more about the network. And then coming to the backend, so we are building the backend application separately. So we'll go to the backend folder wherein we have a Docker file over there, right? So what it will do is that, so when we do build, it will look for the Docker file in the backend directory, and it will create an image, and this service considers that image as a base image, and it does the rest of the things. Depends on. What does this mean is that the backend application will come up only after the database. The reason being is that if the database is not up but the backend application is up, so the backend application eventually talks to the database and it would fail. So the backend application will only come up only when the database is up. Eventually, if the backend is not up, but if the front end is up, what happens? The front end would be trying to talk to the backend and it would fail. That is the reason. So we have depends on backend. So the front end is depending on backend and the backend is depending on DB. That is the reason, if you notice, this Docker Compose file is created in a reverse way, meaning the database is created first, the backend and the front end, such that the entire container, so the entire microservices would come up, ensuring the complete application is up for the users. Got it? And then, so over here we have some environment variables, and as such we are creating the network in the same network, and in the front end same. We have a Docker file in the front end directory. We'll go through that as well, and it will build the image, and that image will be considered as the base image for this front end service. And we are exposing the port, the localhost port 8080. We will be launching the application on the browser on port 8080, and it's pointed to the container port 80. All right, and then it depends on, and we are creating the volume and network over here. That's it. And we'll quickly switch to the front end. We'll quickly see what are we doing over here. We have a Docker file, small Docker file. So the base image is this. We are copying the customized index HTML to this container path, and we are also copying the Nginx configuration file. And we switch to the backend. Okay. Right. Okay, so the base image, so it is a multi-stage Docker file, right? In the stage 1, we are setting up the environment. The base image is this. We are copying the POM file, the source file, the code, and we are building up the application over here. So we are compiling the application here, and then we are copying the jar from the previous build, app jar, exposing on the port 8080, and then we are executing the application. That's all. Hope it is clear for you. We are clear with all the files, the Docker file and the source code file as well. Alright, so I'll go over here, and then we'll bring up this application. So how to up the application through Docker Compose file is Docker Compose up, build, and in a detached mode. So this will look for the Docker Compose YAML file in the current directory. Right, so it is done. Okay, so we'll see whether the Docker Compose has been successfully executed. The way how we see the containers in the general Docker docker ps, the similar command docker compose ps. Perfect. So we can see that front end is up, back end is up, yeah, and the database is also up. Okay, this is again one of the benefit of using the docker compose. So we can see all the relevant containers only with the one single command, and we'll also see the whether the volume and the network has come up, right. So the network is example appnet. Okay, so it has took over the directory name example underscore our network name example underscore appnet. Similarly, we have volume 2, right. So if you see example, the volume name was db data, so example underscore the directory name underscore volume name. All right, so we have all the containers up and all the resources up. Now we'll launch the application on the port number 8088, but before that we'll see the logs. Okay, docker compose logs -. Okay, now let's launch the application. So we'll open the host, port number 8088. Perfect, right? So we can see this application been launching successfully, and now we'll see. Okay, so these are the logs which have got generated, right? And one more beauty of this docker compose is that we can see all the microservices logs related to this docker compose file. If you see, we have logs for backend, front end as well, right? So we don't have to separately list the front end logs and the backend logs, etc. Only with the one command, and all the microservices logs we can see at a one place. All right, so now we'll run some data. Okay, docker compose is very beneficial. Okay, so what happens with this? Okay, so what happens with this, as we explained over here, so when we enter some message on the front end, it posts the message to the backend, and it stores and then the backend stores the message in the database, and after that front end also does the get message to the backend pulls all the messages whatever we have in the db, and then it shows back to the front end. Okay, so this is the way how it happens. So let's see over here, we can see that in the source code as well. Okay, so I have a message sent. Perfect. Okay, so what happened, this message went to the front end has posted that message to the backend has processed and stored that message to the database. We can see them in the logs as well. So what happened? Okay, so if you see over here, okay, so the front end has posted the message at the API/API messages. Okay, and the front end has been launched at 8084. Okay, and the backend has received that message and it has inserted the message into the database. Okay, and then front end has again did the get message to the API/API messages, and the backend has received that message and it selected, meaning it has it is trying to get all the messages from the database table message. Okay, that is the reason it is querying, it is doing select XYZ from message. So this way our docker compose file creates the relation between the microservices. Okay, that's what we try to discuss over here. So why docker compose? It creates the relationship between the microservices of a one given application, wherein we don't have to run several commands, we don't have to look for the history, we don't have to see what are all the resources created, when they've been created successfully or not. So everything, in a very simple word, everything, the microservices, resources like volume, network, configuration, everything in a one single file, which is a docker compose YAML file. And now So we have this. So how to bring down the application now? Meaning is that, so now we have created, so now we have created the volumes, network, all the containers and all, okay, but we have stopped the application as well. That's fine, but let's do Docker Compose PS. We still see the containers are running, we still see the volumes are running, and the networks are also running. Example, this one and volume all running. Okay, what if I wanted to bring down all these containers, all this network, all these volumes, okay, with a one single command? So what I'll do is that, okay, Docker Compose down. So what happens with this, that it brings down all the containers, okay, it brings down our Docker Compose down. Docker Compose down. So what it does is that it brings down containers and network. It doesn't bring down the volume. We'll see that. Okay, Docker Compose down. Okay, so what it says, if you see this, okay, it has removed all the containers and the network, but it did not remove the volume. You can see that Docker Compose or Docker volume ls, right? So we still see example db data over here, okay. And if you wanted to remove this volume, we know the command Docker volume rm and our volume name, example db data, right, removed. Volume ls, we no more see the volume over here. Okay, but if you ask me the question, Kishore, can't we set up the same application without using the Docker Compose? No, we can do that. But it's just that, as we tried explaining in a very brief words, we can do that, but it's just that we'll have to run several commands to create containers, front end, back end, volume, network. Okay, I've also documented them over here in this example, wherein you can try and see how can we set up such 3-tier application without using the Docker Compose, right? So in this example, we are initially creating the volumes, network, the database. We are building the backend image. We are creating the backend container out of this image. Similarly, we are building the front end image and creating the container out of it. So we'll have to run these commands, and we'll have to check whether the volume is up, network is up, the database, front end and the backend containers are up, and it is very difficult to maintain as well. Now we'll see the difficulties or the drawbacks of not using the Docker Compose. So with which we'll move more towards the Docker Compose benefits. So what are the drawbacks of not using the Docker Compose? Drawbacks of not using Docker Compose. Okay, one is manual dependency. Meaning is that we'll have to create all these containers what we discussed, right? The front end, the back end, network, volume and all, and it becomes quite tedious to do that. And another one is network and volume setup, right? So we'll have to set up all the networks and the volume separately. We'll have to run the command separately, and if I wanted to bring down the network, again I'll have to run the command separately. But if I'm using the Docker Compose, I'll just do Docker Compose down. It will bring down all the containers and the network. And then build context, meaning if we are running this all these commands separately, so we will not have the history or the track of what were the commands we used to bring up this application, what are the several commands we run, so on and so forth. But we have all of them in a one single file, and we maintain this file in the version control system like Git, and it is easy to read and understand as well. And then scaling and maintenance. We did not practically see about the scaling, but if you wanted to run four four databases, or the four of the front end or the back end, okay, similar command, docker compose up in the detached mode, scale database equals to 4. So what is this? Like the database, this is the name of the service in the docker compose file. We just saw that we created 3 services, and this is the name of that service in the docker compose file. And then cleanup. So we've already discussed about it. If we use the docker compose, and if we just do the docker compose down, it brings down all the containers, network, and the other resources. If you're not using it, we'll have to run several commands to bring each container, the database, front end, back end, network, so on and so forth. It becomes quite tedious. One of the most important benefit is that readability and reproducibility. Meaning, if we see this docker compose file, it's very easy to read, so we know what are all the various commands we are running, how many services we have, okay, what are the images we are using, volume, network, so on and so forth. Okay, so this is all about the why docker compose, what is docker compose, what are the drawbacks of not using the docker compose, so on and so forth. If you are finding this useful, consider sharing this video across. I will come up with another topic. Until then, cheers, bye bye.